Welcome back to CIA Declassified. Imagine Havana in the early 1960s. The air is heavy with the scent of sea salt, great cigars, diesel exhaust, and the lingering sweet char of cheap tobacco. But beneath the vibrant revolutionary fervor of the streets, a profound and terrifying chill is settling over the island's ancient stones. Fidel Castro has begun his definitive aggressive pivot towards the Soviet orbit, and the very first casualties of this new Marxist reality are the traditional institutions of the old world. The Catholic Church, once the undisputed moral and social bedrock of Cuban life, is being systematically squeezed by the state's tightening fist. Schools that had educated generations of Cubans are being nationalized in a heartbeat. Foreign-born priests who provided the spiritual lifeblood of the rural provinces are being rounded up and expelled on overnight ferries to Spain. This was a systematic attempt to erase the divine from the public square and replace the crucifix with the portrait of the maximum leader. In this atmosphere of escalating religious persecution and state-sponsored atheism, the church didn't simply retreat into the shadows. It became a high-pressure cooker for every simmering grievance against the new regime. For the planners at the CIA, this was not just a humanitarian crisis. It was a golden, once-in-a-generation intelligence opportunity. The agency realized with cold clarity that the local parish was the one singular place the revolutionary committees for the defense of the revolution couldn't fully penetrate without sparking a massive, uncontrollable public backlash from a deeply pious population. To the men sitting in the air-conditioned offices of Langley, the priest confessional was no longer just a vessel for the absolution of sins. It was the ultimate secure communication channel for the transport of high-value secrets. They saw a ready-made island-wide network of safe houses, couriers, and symbols that could move hearts more effectively than any propaganda leaflet dropped from a plane. This was the birth of a strategy where the sanctuary became a bunker and the holy man became a handler. The LIONIZER. Why the LIONIZER? The agency's naming conventions are rarely poetic, but they are always systematic. In the cryptonym architecture of the era, the LI diagraph was the geographic prefix for operations in Cuba. The suffix onizer was a functional identifier for projects involving social support mechanisms or institutional infiltration, but there is a deeper layer to the choice. The term lionize means to treat someone as a celebrity or a person of great importance. The project was designed to lionize key members of the clergy, elevating their status both locally and internationally, so that if the Cuban government moved against them, it would create a global public relations nightmare. By turning local bishops into international icons of freedom, the CIA created a protective shield around the very people they were using to move intelligence and hardware. Behind the incense and the liturgy lay a cold-calculated inventory of clandestine tradecraft. LIONIZER funded the Operation Peter Pan, or Operation Pedro Pan, which saw over 14,000 children flown out of Cuba through church channels. The project utilized the Catholic Welfare Bureau in Miami as a front for operational logistics. Records show the CIA used LIONIZER to smuggle shortwave radios into rectories across the island. The agency subsidized the travel of missionary assets who were actually trained intelligence observers. Documentation confirms that LIONIZER provided financial support for the underground publication La Quincena, Quincena. The project used the diplomatic bag of the Vatican to move sensitive documents out of Havana. Records verify that LIONIZER-funded priests provided safe houses for members of the Brigade 2506 before the Bay of Pigs. The CIA created religious-themed propaganda broadcasts to be played over Radio Swan. Internal audits reveal the agency used church-affiliated charities to distribute incentive funds to anti-Castro labor leaders. The project facilitated the exfiltration of high-ranking Cuban defectors disguised as traveling friars. Documentation shows the CIA used LIONIZER to map the social networks of pious military officers within the Cuban army. Records confirm that LIONIZER operatives utilized parish record-keeping systems to hide the identities of resistance members. The agency funded the training of Cuban seminaries in Spain who were briefed on intelligence-gathering techniques. LIONIZER utilized microfilm hidden within hollowed-out rosary beads for data transport. The project provided the resources for the Christian Democrat underground groups within the island. Records show the CIA used the cover of feast day processions to conduct clandestine handoffs. The project subsidized the salaries of parish secretaries who acted as cutouts for messages. Documentation confirms the agency used LIONIZER to provide medical supplies to rural churches as a door opener for recruitment. The project monitored the sermons of pro-revolutionary priests, the so-called with the revolution clergy, to identify internal schisms. Records verify that LIONIZER funded the legal defense for arrested clergy members to keep them as active symbols of resistance. The CIA utilized the nuncio, the Vatican ambassador, to relay high-level messages to European heads of state. LIONIZER orchestrated spontaneous religious protest in cities like Santiago. The project documented the confiscation of church property to use in UN human rights dossiers. Documentation shows the use of invisible ink on the back of prayer cards for field communication. Records confirm that the agency used LIONIZER to recruit CRE, Catholic Relief Services, workers for field spotting. The project provided high-calorie rations to church-run kitchens to buy the loyalty of the starving populace. Internal memos show that LIONIZER operatives were instructed to emphasize the atheistic nature of Marxism in all interactions. The project utilized religious radio stations in Haiti and the Dominican Republic to broadcast coded messages. Records show the CIA used LIONIZER to identify moral leaders who could serve in a post-Castro government. The project operated a secret scarcity press for printing anti-communist flyers in Havana. A quote from Richard Bissell, former CIA Deputy Director for Plans: "The church was the only organization that Castro could not simply shoot out of existence without losing the heart of the people." A quote from Howard Hunt, CIA case officer: "We found the priest's collar was the most effective disguise for a man carrying a radio transmitter." A quote from a redacted LIONIZER field asset: "In Cuba, the altar was the last piece of ground that didn't belong to the state." And a quote from a declassified internal CIA planning memo dated 1962: "The religious sentiment of the Cuban population is the most potent weapon we have against the Sovietization of the island." End quote. The files on LIONIZER are notoriously Swiss cheesed with redactions under FOIA exemptions B1 and B3. While B1 is standard, the B3 redactions often cite the National Security Act of 1947, protecting, quote, "intelligence sources and methods," end quote. What is the agency still hiding 60 years later? My theory is that the redactions mask the direct involvement of the Holy See in Rome. While the official history claims the Vatican was a neutral observer, the redacted logs likely contain proof of a direct line between the CIA and the Vatican's secret archives. I believe the redactions protect the papal assets, high-ranking cardinals who were essentially on the CIA's payroll, or at least acting as strategic advisors. These files likely show that the agency didn't just support the Cuban church. They were actively designing the church's political stance from a basement in Langley, essentially treating the Pope's representatives as an extension of the United States government. Then there are other theories. When the sanctuary becomes a war room, the line between faith and fiction does tend to disappear. For instance, there's the stigmata signal theory. Some speculate that the CIA experimented with psychological projection during religious festivals, using hidden projectors or voice of God speakers to induce miraculous sightings. The theory suggests that lionizer agents wanted to create a holy panic that would lead to a mass uprising, believing that a religious fervor could override the fear of Castro's secret police. Then there's the poison communion speculation, a darker theory, which suggests that the CIA considered using the distribution of communion wafers as a way to mark high-ranking Cuban officials with a slow-acting traceable chemical. This would allow the agency to track the movements of the revolutionaries' inner circle through simple Geiger counters at various checkpoints, effectively turning the sacrament into a tracking device. And then there's the baptismal recruit conspiracy. Speculation persists that Lionizer didn't just target the clergy, but actively sought to recruit the godparents of high-ranking Communist Party children. The theory is that by controlling the spiritual family of the regime, the CIA could exert generational pressure and gather intelligence from the most intimate domestic circles of the Castro brothers. Was Lionizer a success? Tactically, it was a miracle of logistic resilience. The agency successfully built a human intelligence network that survived the most paranoid years of the Cuban security state. Tactically, the use of the church as a safety valve for dissent allowed the CIA to preserve thousands of anti-communist assets who would have otherwise been executed. It proved that cultural institutions are far more durable than political ones. By utilizing the existing hierarchy, the agency created a self-healing network. When one priest was arrested, another took his place, and the Holy-Hearth continued to burn. This tactical victory allowed the U.S. to maintain a persistent presence on the island during the dark years when other networks were being rolled up by Cuban counterintelligence. It demonstrated that established trusted social networks are significantly harder to infiltrate and dismantle than artificial intelligence networks created from scratch by a foreign power. Strategically, it was a spiritual stalemate. While Lionizer prevented the total Sovietization of the Cuban mind, it failed to trigger the popular uprising the CIA hoped for. Strategically, it forced the Castro regime to tolerate a degree of religious independence, which served as a long-term infection of dissent within the Marxist state. However, it also led to the permanent militarization of the church's secular interactions, leaving a legacy of suspicion that still haunts Cuban-Vatican relations today. The program effectively created a fifth column that could be activated during a crisis, but it never reached the critical mass necessary for regime change. Ultimately, while it preserved a moral alternative to communism, it also gave the regime a clear enemy to target, justifying further crackdowns and the further isolation of the Cuban people. The strategic success was found not in victory, but in the denial of a total Soviet ideological conquest. As far as operational and technological breakthroughs go, the Holy-Hearth led to quite a few, such as sacramental cover logistics, the perfection of using religious rituals and vessels, chalices, tabernacles, for the concealment and transport of specialized equipment. This methodology has been adapted for modern humanitarian cover operations. Intelligence services today use the logistics of NGOs and religious aid groups to move special purpose equipment into war zones and disaster areas where traditional military transport would be blocked. This is a primary method for inserting sensors and communication hubs into denied areas and environments under the guise of medical or spiritual aid. Then we have encryption systems, the development of codes based on the Latin Mass and Common Prayer structure to pass information through public broadcast. This is the direct ancestor of stenography and digital communication. Modern agencies use the background noise of public social media posts or religious broadcasts to hide encrypted packets of data, a digital version of the Lionizer sermon code. It allows for high-volume data transfer through seemingly mundane public channels that bypass standard automated surveillance filters. Institutional safe haven doctrine, the formalizing of sanctuary sites where intelligence assets can hide under the protection of international moral law. This doctrine is utilized by the intelligence community to establish safe houses within diplomatic missions and international medical facilities. It relies on the inviolability of certain spaces to protect HVTs, high value targets, in hostile environments. It has been expanded into the digital realm as virtual sanctuaries within cloud infrastructure owned by neutral third parties. Mass psychology, symbol manipulation, the use of traditional religious and cultural symbols to trigger specific behavioral responses in a target population, e.g., the Virgin of Charity versus the godless state. This is a core component of modern MISO, military information support operations. Psychological operations teams use deeply rooted cultural and religious icons to influence public opinion and degrade the legitimacy of extremist groups in regions like the Middle East and Africa. By aligning Western interests with local spiritual values, the military can effectively counter-message extremist ideologies on their own cultural turf. The LIONIZER project proves that in the shadow war, even the most sacred spaces are not immune to the reach of the state. The Holy-Hearth was so successful because it understood that a man's loyalty to his God is often the only thing stronger than his fear of his government. When we look at the legacy of this project, we see the blueprint for how soft power and spiritual warfare are waged in the modern world. The agency proved that if you can own a man's conscience, you don't need to own his country. The echoes of LIONIZER are everywhere in the way we view faith-based resistance today. We live in a world where religious freedom is often a code word for political autonomy and where the pulpit remains the most dangerous stage in the world. The techniques developed in the cathedrals of Havana have been refined and deployed in every major conflict of the last 50 years. The agency didn't just fund a church, they discovered that spirituality is the ultimate shadow network. By hacking that network, they ensured that even in the most restricted societies, there would always be a place where the state could not see and where the agency could wait. Thanks for listening. Keep your eyes on the altar and your ears on the sermon. Always verify your blessings. Secure your sanctuary, and remember, even in the presence of the divine, the agency is watching from a back pew. Join us next time as we examine QR Jack, the global front and dawn of the jet age. When a spy needs to cross a border without leaving a footprint, the agency turns to the ghost and the passport. We'll uncover the invisible logistics of QR Jack, the secret protocol that created empty identities, people who don't exist traveling to places that shouldn't be reached. It's a story of identity erasure and phantom logistics, where the most dangerous traveler is the one who isn't there. Join us next time for the paper wraith. In the meantime, I'll see you in the archives.